I now turn over to our partner in presenting this, to chair the panel, David McCain, who can introduce the colleagues on the panel and take it from there. Thanks, David.
Thanks, David. Thanks for co-hosting this with us. This is a terrific event. I also want to thank Tony Blinken, who I think just did a superb job. I am the Director of Policy Planning, as David said earlier, and as many of you know, that occupies somewhat of a unique place in the Department of State. It was created when Secretary of State George Marshall instructed Undersecretary of State Dean Atkinson that he wanted a group within the department to sort of do some strategic thinking. And Atkinson described it like this. He said, to look ahead, not in the distant future, but beyond the vision of the operating officers caught in the smoking crises of current battle, far enough ahead to see the emerging form of things to come. And of course, Atchison and Marshall together hired George Kennan to do that. I think one of the great strengths of Kennan was that he had a great appreciation for history when he came to the job. And he understood that the Soviet Union was a historical force. He also accurately assessed how it would act and where its weaknesses would emerge. So he occupies a very unique place in our history in the State Department. He's obviously the author of Containment. We'll be looking for that one frame today that will solve the world's problems. I'm not confident we'll find it. But we do have a terrific group up here, and let me just quickly introduce them. Ambassador Tom Shannon is former ambassador to Brazil. He's currently the senior advisor to Secretary Kerry. Jim Baker is the Principal Deputy Director for Strategy for the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Department of Defense. David Burwell is the Director of Energy and Climate Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Jack Gerard is the President and CEO of the American Petroleum Institute. And Jack, I know you've got to leave at 10:30 to testify on the Hill. Many of you have seen the Washington Post this morning and the photograph of Secretary Kerry testifying before the House Foreign Affairs Committee with his head in his hands, looking entirely exasperated now what a joy it is to testify on Capitol Hill. So I hope you have a better experience. But let's just start here. And I think in the spirit of George Kennan, I might just start with a question that takes us back, not forward, and ask all of you, what do you think the greatest lesson we may have learned in the last 10 to 15 years is in foreign policy and defense policy? Either that we learned or perhaps that we should have learned. And Tom, let me start with you, if I can.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the question. And I'm glad it's retrospective because speaking after Tony Blinken and before John Kerry and trying to be prospective would be a big challenge. But obviously there are many lessons that we can take away from what has happened over the past 10 to 15 years, because what we've really seen in the globalization of so much of what we're doing is also a globalization of diplomacy and a globalization of our foreign policy. And I think we've learned principally that there is no part of the world that can be neglected now. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, when we thought we had solved problems in Europe and in Asia, we realized that we really hadn't. And then as we focused on the Cold War and our larger challenges with the Soviet Union, we also thought that we were fighting a global struggle, but one that was limited to certain geographic theaters. But in a post-Cold War world, I think we've learned that everything is in play, and that the information revolution and a 24-hour news cycle means that everything has a political impact. And it requires a diplomacy that is flexible and is agile, and that is capable of understanding global trends, and not trends that move slowly, but trends that move quickly. And this is why jobs such as yours and the work that your team does at State Department is so important broadly for our larger diplomacy, because those of us who are trapped in the day-to-day urgency of events oftentimes lose sight of the larger changes that are taking place and the impact that they're going to have broadly on our diplomacy.
Jim, what would you say?
I think I would say a lesson that we will learn is the criticality of continued U.S. leadership it's going to become very apparent that a U.S. that focuses on retrenchment or overlearns the lessons of overseas involvement is not going to be a world that benefits all of us more broadly. And I worry a little bit about that when I look at the results, for example, of the Pew poll that just recently came out that compared American domestic audiences with American foreign policy elites, and a sharp disparity in terms of willingness to sort of provide that leadership continuously.
David?
I think one lesson is the importance of international institutions to solving these problems. You can talk about the G20 or the G8 or even G2, US and China, but if you look at the way problems have been solved, we need these institutions to implement look at the Chemical Weapons Treaty. We look for the IAEA now is implementing that. The Iran situation, that is being resolved with the IAEA. On climate change, you've got the IMF, the World Bank, UN, and the International Energy Agency, all saying climate is a co-mission of those organizations. So the idea that we need these institutions to implement these agreements and create a global consensus is really important.
Jack?
Just in light of what others have said, I think one of the things we are learning now and are learning quickly is the role particular issues play, like energy, in changing that global environment, turning many of the assumptions and the practices of the past, if you will, somewhat on their head, and changing that dynamic in such a significant way. It will reshape the world and national security, foreign policy as we know it today. When we look at the energy equation just 5 or 6 years ago, even those of us in the industry, in the oil and gas space, could never have predicted what's taking place today. The last 5 or 6 years, largely driven by technology and technological advancements, the United States is poised to now really become the epicenter of oil and gas production in the world. We've just surpassed Russia in natural gas production. IEA came out just last week and predicted we'll now surpass Saudi Arabia in our oil production. So I think as we look at the global framework in which we operate, issues like this, and going back to the survey, I thought was interesting that U.S. competitiveness is a top priority or seen by such. From a U.S. perspective, this is really a twofer. It changes the global environment. At the same time, it's a big aid or assistance in enhancing our competitiveness here at home, creating jobs, bringing manufacturing jobs home, et cetera. So I think we're seeing a very rapid shift in the world, driven heavily by this energy equation, something that we all rely on and need to fuel our economies and to advance our societies.
So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, Jack. I mean, what's going to be the composition of American energy moving forward between, David, you want to talk about this as well, between renewables and oil? And I mean, do you believe we're going to be energy independent? And if so, what are the foreign policy implications? Particularly, Tom, I don't know if you want to chime in at some point about implications for our relationships with other countries, with the Middle East.
Well, I think, David, the implications are far-reaching. I think they're even farther reaching than many of us even think of today. And why I say that is, like I say, just 5 years ago, no one would have predicted the U.S. would be where it is today. But think about it now in the relationships, particularly in the Middle East. Our whole framework there is beginning to shift. The U.S. today, we used to be relying on imports. 60% of our energy was imported in the form of oil just a few years ago. That's already dropped to 38%. We're producing 2 million barrels a day more today in the U.S. than we were just a few years ago. And it's estimated over the next couple of years, we'll add another 2 million barrels to that. Once again, surpassing Saudi Arabia, Russia, etc. So what will that do? Well, it's having economic implications that we couldn't predict. Look at the manufacturing base. A few years ago, I used to be in the chemistry space, and a lot of our jobs were being exported to China and elsewhere. Today, those jobs are coming home here in the United States, and it's driven by the cost of natural gas. You look at the climate change conversation. The U.S. today is leading the world in terms of reducing are carbon emissions. That's primarily driven by natural gas displacing coal in generating electricity, combined with auto efficiency standards on the part of this administration and a few other things. So be it the Middle East, be it our relationship with Russia, I know there are many here, the diplomatic corps represented today, there are many in Europe very anxious to see the United States export natural gas. That will change the relationship between Russia and the European continent as well. So we can add China to that, we can add some of the conversation Anthony mentioned earlier about security. There's lots of implications, and I think we're just on the front edge of really understanding just how significant all these really are.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit bipolar on this issue. On the energy side, it's obviously terrific news, as Jack said. I don't think we're going to become an energy autarky country. We're always going to be involved in international trade on energy. Obviously, I think a benefit of the fossil fuel abundance in the United States, particularly because we're different from other petro states in that we don't need the revenues from production of fossil fuels to run our budget. So we can use and manage these fuels much more efficiently and we have much more discretion. We can sip, not gulp. We can try to identify the low carbon fuels first, export low carbon, require low carbon use of the fuels when we export them. So I think that gives us a lot of discretion on managing fossil fuels. We do have the problem on climate change that we're, if you look at what IEA is saying now, basically we are, the door to, or the window to 2 degrees Celsius is closed. We're now looking at least 3.5 to 5 degrees Celsius. Nobody knows what the impacts of those are. Climate is amplifier of social disorder and disruption, extreme weather. Good point made by one of the questioners. Is we're having more failed states, and the failed states are states that are affected by extreme weather tend to fail faster. If you overlook the failed states and the ones with really problems with drought and extreme weather, they overlap. So those are important. I think one final issue is that the question about renewables and the rapid transition into clean technology. It's very welcome. 3 regions have kind of staked their economic future on this: the United States and transfer of clean energy technology. The EU itself is very concerned about it, and China. China wants to be a leader. So the question is: are we going to compete with each other on these grounds and try to maximize our own particular advantage, or are we going to cooperate on technology transfer and IP issues and things like that, so that the whole world benefits from clean technology and we don't compete?
Tom and Jim?
Sure. The idea that the United States could become energy sufficient, or close to energy sufficient over time, and have a cheap source of energy is going to have a huge impact. It already is having a huge impact on our industrial base, and is going to promote a new kind of industrial revolution in the United States, a very innovative, high-tech, very specialized industrial revolution, which I think is going to strengthen the United States economy markedly, and that I think is good for the global economy. It's going to be a stabilizing factor, but it's also going to be a factor for science and technology, research and development, and innovation, which we're going to be able to use in our diplomacy as we engage with our partners around the world who are also refashioning their industrial bases. So I think at the bottom line, it's a positive stabilizing factor for the United States and for the globe. I also believe that as our public utilities move away from coal, it's also going to change the climate change debate in the United States. It's going to create a greater space for those who are arguing for more aggressive steps in regard to climate change. But in terms of our broader Middle East diplomacy, given the emergence of significant middle classes around the world in China and India and Brazil, in Nigeria, Mexico, South Africa, Indonesia, and the demands that they're making on their own governments for better lives, use of energy is not going to decline over time. And so even though the United States might be using less and less oil from the Middle East, the rest of the world will not be. And that is actually going to give us an opportunity to build a much more collaborative approach to Middle East politics and to engage other partners more directly in Middle Eastern security, because their interests would be more pointed and dramatic than ours.
Jim?
Well, I think I agree with the rest of the panel. It's definitely a big W for not just the United States, but for the world at large. It seems to me it makes most of our policy challenges far more tractable. For
Can I encourage you to speak up a little bit? I'm standing in the back of the room and advocating on behalf of the people at the back tables here, so
Thank you, sir.
thanks.
For example, Iranian sanctions were easier for many partners because of the influx of American energy onto the market. So a little bit, it relieves some pressure on them to maybe have to fudge a little bit. It certainly helps China's growth. It definitely will help Japan, Korea. They're big winners. Are there little L losers in this? I don't really know. I suppose that Russia might see some loss of energy leverage over Europe, although I think that's sort of to be determined. The price of oil, I think, was projected to be about $170 a barrel. So for Russia, they can easily sustain present practices at that. Gas, I think, is a little bit less clear. It also, from China, it also stresses a little bit more the Malacca dilemma that they face, and so I'd expect them to become more anxious about what flows through there and who's providing security for it. I see a great deal of speculation that it will lead to lesser involvement in the Middle East, particularly on the military or from the defense side. I also don't know if that's necessarily true. We have many interests, security interests in the region that go beyond safeguarding the flow of resources, which will remain still a predominant one for us, even with the U.S. energy, more U.S. energy coming online. Now, is it a big W in the future? I align myself with David's comments here. I am a little bit worried about us blowing through 2 degrees Celsius and getting to 4. It seems to me that abundant energy reduces the impetus to find renewables, although I would defer to Jack's expertise there. And as a result, we are moving into possibly geoadaptation, not reversal.
Since everyone has talked about climate, let me ask Jack and David about that. I mean, I thought there was a fascinating article in the New York Times last week that said that I think 29 major U.S. corporations were incorporating into their strategic plans cap and trade. Doesn't necessarily mean that they endorsed it, but they think it's important issue to explore, that in many cases they believe that it is something that will ultimately come to pass. There are 8 countries now that have cap and trade programs. China is experimenting with it in, I believe, in 3 major cities, 2 provinces. Is that the solution to mitigating the climate problem? And if not, what do we do? Jack?
Well, I think a couple quick things, David, on the New York Times article and others. I think that what you see in corporate America is they're incorporating the cost of carbon. Some believe the cap and trade approach is a solution. Others believe carbon tax is a solution. Of course, there's others who don't incorporate it in their planning at all. But I think it also points out the significance of this issue and the corporate leadership involved. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the leaders in trying to get the breakthrough technologies to deal with the challenge on a global scale, the oil and natural gas industry leads in terms of investments, trying to find zero carbon emitting technologies or low carbon emitting technologies. Many people don't realize that, but if you go back to 2000 and fast forward to 2012, the oil and gas industry has spent more in the federal government in trying to find these breakthrough technologies, and has actually spent just slightly less than all other industries combined. So from an oil and gas perspective, we see the key to a lot of this, as we do with energy breakthrough on renewables and others. It's about technology. It's about that breakthrough. 5 years ago, many didn't realize that the breakthrough we found in technology in horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing has really led us to where we are today. So I think the key is to continue to look to the marketplace to help drive some of those solutions as we grapple with the policy implications both domestically and globally, to make sure we don't overlook those that are heavily invested in trying to get to that next energy paradigm. And I believe ultimately, you see it now, like I say, in some of the assumptions in corporate planning, people assuming certain prices of carbon. As the ambassador pointed out, demand for energy on a global scale continues to increase. Others want to enjoy the same middle-class standard of living we have for many years. So it's front and center for a lot of folks, and the key is to continue to invest, to drive hard, to get that breakthrough and technological advancement, as others have mentioned, that then can go global in scale to benefit all.
Yeah, that article is not new news. I mean, actually, you got to give credit. I give credit to the oil and gas industries. They're pretty open about the fact that they have a shadow price on carbon. Even say what it is. ExxonMobil is $80, Total it's $70 per ton. Royal Dutch Shell it's $40 per ton. They don't make an investment unless they make money, even putting that shadow price on the cost. The problem, they all admit it, is you know there's no policy yet, and we owe our first allegiance to our shareholders, and we'll get killed by the competition if we do this. So they're all looking for policy. They're concerned about stranded assets. It's pretty obvious that we can't produce all the oil, gas, and coal and fossil fuels that we've already discovered and stay even within 6 degrees Celsius. So, but they're looking for policy to intervene, and that's if we could all get around the table and discuss what this policy is going to be. I've talked to a lot of the skeptics. They've got concerns. The main concern not is about that climate change doesn't exist or that it's significant or that it's anthropogenic and it's serious. It's that the problem is is the solution more harmful than the disease here. They look around the world, and there's a lot of countries that are pretty corrupt and even kleptocracies. And how are you going to impose a carbon price on the world if most of the people, a lot of these countries, can just take the money and exploit their own people and exploit their resource base? So this is something that we've. I think the science is in. The problem is clear. We just got to have policy to intervene.
Well, on the subject of great challenges, great problems, Jim, tell me what keeps you and the Joint Chiefs of Staff up at night. What are you worried about the most as you look out over the next decade?
Yeah, I actually made a list here. It's pretty long. So, I mean,
It's full head hair.
I think for me, the 5 big known trends that we'll be grappling with, not just as a military, but as a government, are going to be China's rise and the region's reaction to that rise, the Arab awakening and its aftermath, the aftershocks of the 2008 financial crisis, and the leaks from Snowden, I think, will continue to be. And for me, that actually rises to the same level as those other 4. Speaking very parochially, I think the Joint Chiefs are preoccupied right now with how to manage under a lower defense budget. And right now, that lower defense budget is manifesting itself in less ready forces. And that's a little bit of a hard concept to understand. What do we mean by readiness? But what it means is that forces that are immediately available to deploy worldwide for any type of crisis situation. We saw a great example of this just recently with the humanitarian support for after the Philippines, this terrible climate event there. I think that the other thing that I often hear them speak about is the implications of cyber. And here, the problem is not so much that we don't have the capabilities, but sometimes we lack the policy or authority or even the norms about how to use this tool. And we've invested a lot of money in creating a terrific cyber capability. I worry about others who are close to having that capability as well. And there not being a very common understanding about how we would go about using that tool. In many domains, we've had centuries of times to sort of figure out the rules of the road. Sea is the most common one. We know how we act and react around military forces at sea. It's not quite as clear how that works in the cyber domain.
You mentioned Snowden, and Tom, you've just come back from Latin America. You've had a lot of experience there. we also have been dealing with a lot of the disclosure issues. Can you, and in many ways, Latin America, I think we've gotten sort of the toughest reaction to some of these disclosure issues. The state visit with Brazil's council, and there's been a lot of negative media. Can you talk a little bit about, well, first of all, just about our relations with Latin America going forward, about the opportunity you see there, about our relationships with Venezuela and Cuba. Are we going to be able to, looking down the road, how do you see those emerging? And whether or not the Snowden disclosures have overshadowed our relationships for the time being.
No, happily, and I'll do the Snowden stuff last. Because first I think it's important to lay out a bigger picture of what's been happening in our hemisphere over the last several decades. I mean, people know well the story through the latter part of the 20th century of especially South America, but also Central America's moved from authoritarian government to democratic government. But there's also been a movement from closed economies to open economies, from import substitution driven models of development to regional economic integration models of development, and from relative international isolation to globalization. This is true for several of the larger countries of South America, but it's also true for Central America as it does association agreements with the European Union and seeks to do free trade agreements across the Pacific into Asia, and as all of these countries attempt to join our Trans-Pacific Partnership in one form or another, or Asian-Pacific Economic Cooperation relationships. And the globalization of Latin America, but especially the globalization of South America, I think is going to be one of the most interesting stories of the first part of this 21st century, because for the most part it's going to be done by countries that are democratic, that have open economies, that are committed to international institutions and standard and regulation-based trade, and I think are going to be a platform for stability in an international trading setting as they develop their own internal markets and become attractive to the rest of the world. But these countries are also in the midst of doing something quite remarkable, which is moving from democratic governments to democratic states and democratic societies. And what I mean by that is that these are countries that have mastered the peaceful transition of power through elections and have effectively, for the most part, removed violent overthrows of government and violence during political change, and have a broad commitment to constitutional processes and procedures. But in the course of doing this, they've been confronting, obviously, the profound social inequities that have characterized them historically, such as poverty, inequality, and social exclusion. And the ability of these countries, and I'm speaking here of countries like Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Uruguay, Mexico, and some of the Central American countries, the ability to use democratic governance models and free market economies to address long-standing social inequities and development issues is quite remarkable. And they really have built a democratic development model which is quite distinct from, say, China's development model, and one that I think should cheer us, because as we look out into the world and we see regions of the world that are trying to move from authoritarian government to democratic government, from closed economies to open economies, from autarkic models of development to regional integration, and from isolation to globalization, what's been happening throughout this hemisphere, but especially in South America, is very encouraging. And I think it provides some guideposts and some inspiration to our partners around the world who are challenging, or facing similar challenges. And obviously, the importance of a democratic society is going to be crucial to our larger diplomacy, because we are seeing generally across the globe the emergence of societies and peoples as major drivers of government action. And this is true not only in democracies, but even in authoritarian governments. And the extent to which that we, with our partners in Latin America, can show that we can make our diplomacy relevant on a daily basis to people's lives, and that it does indeed respond not only to the needs of the state and the needs of government, but to the broad needs of our society, and build connections. This is hugely helpful to us, and it creates a strategic reserve in the Western Hemisphere, which is largely peaceful, non-nuclear, and focused on building economies and building people's access to our three fundamental values, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which are going to be hugely important as we address larger security problems around the globe. In regard to Snowden, obviously it's had a huge impact and one that's been a major challenge for us as we engage with some of our most important partners, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, among them. But as we deal with this, we have an open conversation with all of these countries. We've engaged with them to the extent we can and on these issues. And these are very difficult and challenging issues, as you can imagine, because of the nature of the allegations. But what is striking for me, as we do engage with the governments and societies broadly, is that the principal allegation of espionage, while important for the moment and one that has to be addressed in our relationships with governments, the larger issue is really that of metadata and the collection of big data and how that is used. Because if nothing else, what the Snowden disclosures have done is give us some insight into what the 21st century is going to be like. And it's really not about espionage here. It's about how new forms of technology, new forms of communication, and new forms of analyzing and understanding that communication are going to radically change our understanding of privacy, radically change our idea of individual agency and behavioral patterns. And also what they mean for our societies as they try to connect to each other. And in this regard, the National Security Agency, while maybe leading the way in mapping the internet and mapping our larger global communication structures, has many partners around the world, both in the private sector and in the public sector. And so I think what we're slowly moving towards over time is a larger and more fruitful and productive conversation about how you manage information technology in the 21st century and what issues like metadata or big data are going to mean for us.
Perfect. Sure, then just a quick answer, and then David, I think we might take some questions from the audience. All right.
Just want to say something about big data. I think it's important, and what Tom said is important. A lot of the problems we've talked about can't be solved from the top down. They have to be solved from engagement within civil society. And I think one of the positive things is civil society wants to engage. The governments are engaging with civil society. I think the State Department is taking the lead on this open government partnership issue, which I think is really a terrific initiative, but they need information. Civil society needs information. So there are concerns about big data and privacy, but we also, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. If we want to get civil society engaged, let's give the information freely available so money flows. A lot of things can be more transparent.
Thank you.
Okay, let's open it up to some questions out here from the audience. I'll start over here. And let's keep the questions fairly brief and the answers fairly brief. We've got 15 minutes to go.
And I guess Jack has to leave pretty soon, so 1 minute.
That's right.
I just have 1 second. Since Jack has to leave in a minute, does anybody have a question for Jack? Okay, quick question for Jack here.
Just make it easy, Dave.
An easy question for Jack, so he leaves in a good mood.
That's right.
I don't know if it'll be easy, but I'm Sylvia McAdam. I'm one of the global thinkers. My question to you is, there's issues arising globally, and I speak from Canada specifically now. The activities that are happening in terms of industry there, extracting resources from indigenous lands, and yet Canada has not shown title to our lands. I don't see how industry can go into these countries, and with the global resistance that's happening from indigenous people, how do you see moving forward with countries, even as Canada violates the treaties that they've made with indigenous people? I'm sure that scenario is not uncommon in other countries as well.
Well, I obviously can't speak for Canada today. There might be some in the audience who can. But let me say as a general practice across the oil and gas industry, and I have the great privilege and honor to represent many of the biggest players who obviously operate on a global scale. they have visions for sustainability, if you will, as they move into countries, different regions and areas, and make establishing and assisting those areas an important part of that development. And that comes all the way from the top to the bottom, from schooling, from medical care, from infrastructure. The issues go on and on. So I will tell you, the general ethic of the broader oil and gas sector is to not only respect indigenous rights and others, but to make sure, as we position ourselves to produce the energy the world's going to need, that we are mindful of those sensitive issues, some of which you've raised, others related to the environment. Talk about the climate questions. We talk about engagements with foreign governments and others. But I'll tell you, from the oil and gas perspective, this is a top priority. We're very sensitive to it. We're focused on it. And we believe as we move forward, it's important to have that social license, if you will, to operate on a global scale and to make sure the energy we're producing is done in an appropriate way to not only protect the workforces, but the local communities and the environment at the same time we're doing it. And I've got to step away, David, so thank you very much. I look forward to doing it again sometime.
Thank you, Jackson. As you see, we offered you up a softball question there. You handled it extremely well. Short question, short answer.
Thank you so much to the Foreign Policy Group to invite me for this event. I am Ruben Usechi. I live in Quito, Ecuador. I am Colombian, and I am international consultant and attorney in the region. And I am particularly interested in Latin American issues because I am considered that right now we are in a difficult situation. Our building, some floors are on fire, in particular of the problem that we have in the past with Colombia. My question is, Ambassador Shannon, if the U.S. Relations with Latin America is going in the right direction with the invitation of John Kerry about the end of the Monroe Doctrine and try to build a partnership for the Americas.
Well, building partnerships is the right direction, and it has been a focus of this administration since President Obama took office, and it was a focus of Secretary Clinton, and it's been an important focus of Secretary Kerry. While he has obviously spent a lot of time addressing issues in the Middle East and working on the Iran issue, he's also taken several trips to Latin America. And it's all been about engaging with some of our key partners down there as we look for ways to fashion cooperative partnerships that are going to be meaningful. And some of this relates back to what I said earlier. But this is a region which has come into its own, which has emerged regionally as, I think, an interesting and productive player in a larger global scene. And Colombia, for instance, the Colombian president was just up to see President Obama. And Colombia now sees itself as a global player in a way that historically it really never has, as it's consolidated its national destiny, as it has addressed the issue of insurgency and begins to make significant progress in its peace talks with the FARC. It now understands that it has global reach into Central America, into the Caribbean, into the Andes, and across the Pacific. And as such, as South America's second largest economy, is going to be a significant player in the Americas and beyond. And we really see this for the rest of the region. And therefore, in this environment, and with these countries having so many different options, just as we have to make our diplomacy relevant to the everyday lives of our own citizens and the citizens of our partners, we also have to make that diplomacy relevant to our partners because they have other options and choices. And so that's why partnerships are going to be such a crucial part of what we try to do.
Do we have some other questions out here in the audience on some other issues? Yes, okay, we'll go over here. We've got about 5 minutes to go. Go ahead, just hold it up.
Azerbaijan State Telegraph Agency. My question is probably best addressed to Ambassador Shannon. As you know, there's a southern gas corridor that transports Caspian gas to, is going to transport Caspian gas to Europe. Is there as much active engagement on part of the United States to supplement that corridor with new sources of gas, for instance, through the Trans-Caspian pipeline or from the gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean in the future? Thank you.
It's a great question. I'm afraid I don't have a great answer. In fact, I'm going to turn to my colleagues here.
David, do you have a great answer?
Well, a great answer. I think one of the
Do you have an
contributions.
acceptable answer?
Yeah, acceptable answer. I think one of the greatest contributions of the United States to natural gas supply is the fact that we don't have to import. We're almost independent in natural gas. So providing that lack of demand is important. I do think the Leviathan field in eastern Mediterranean is an important, a very important resource. How that gas is going to actually get to Europe is problematic. We've got South Stream. I think Nabucco is not going to happen. But I don't think that supply is really going to be over the long term a real killer because there's so much of it in that area. If the question is, are we going to support a particular pipeline? I don't think so. I think that's more of a regional issue, but I think there's a lot of options.
Lynette Yadamboachi, global thinker. It's really heartening to hear, particularly from the CEO of American Petroleum, that there's finally like some acceptance of the causes and effects of climate change. But I was just wondering, I suppose on a more general level, particularly in terms of business and just the American people themselves, how much support there is for actually doing something about it. I mean, there will be policies put in place and so on, but I was just wondering whether there's actually a lot being done to increase that support, because I'm not entirely convinced of the strength of that support as yet, since people are so dependent on these fuels.
I guess that's a question for me.
Sure.
Yeah, I think I can reassure you that, and I don't know where you're from again. What country? UK. Okay. There is. I mean, the polls say over 60%, over 70% of Americans believe climate change is happening. It's anthropogenic and it's significant. Over 60% of Republicans believe the same thing, which is really more important. I think we have a political problem here. I think it's a Washington problem. I think it's about ideology. It's not about science. I referred before to there's a very philosophical difference between the parties on the role of government intervention, private markets, skepticism about international solutions to problems. So I think, and I've personally been trying to reach out to the skeptics on how these transactional problems of how we can make sure any price is effective and the revenues are used for good uses, not bad uses, how we can reduce the extent of government intervention. I mean, I find it ironic that here we have Shanghai doing a cap and trade carbon markets, and the United States, we're against cap and trade, against a market-based approach. It's difficult, but I think the importance of the issue is going to resolve these differences shortly. I do think we should have some leadership within this administration on the importance of a price on carbon. And if you really want to get rid of coal, put a price on carbon. It's going to be dead. I mean, right now, natural gas and carbon and coal are in a very close competition throughout Appalachia. If you put a price on carbon, coal is out. Unfortunately, we have a problem with coal exports. Yes, I think we have a will. We just have a political problem.
Okay, we've got time for one question and one quick answer. One of the things that I hope you'll see throughout the day is that we stick to our schedule, and we've only got about 3 minutes left on this panel. So quick question, quick answer.
Good morning. I'm Lindsay Coates from Interaction, which is the united voice for social change of the US-based NGO community. I'm a friend of a global thinker who's here in the room, Homi Karas, and I'm surprised there's been very little discussion of the Millennium Development Goals and the challenge particularly that is posed by the growing income inequality in middle income countries and what that really means for us in terms of our foreign policy and how we engage in the fight on global poverty. I'd love some comments on that.
Thanks. Maybe if I may direct that to Jim, since you've been sitting in the middle, and talk about the degree to which within the US national security community, issues like income inequality are seen as potentially threatening, and where the growing gaps may in fact fuel instability and other issues.
Well, I think the answer is they're virtually not considered at all in national security decision making. I mean, the plain fact of the matter is that the crisis du jour, whatever it happens to be, Iran or Syria or ADISs, tend to dominate the day-to-day conversation in the interagency. There are attempts, and I actually give this administration a lot of credit for occasionally trying to raise us all up above that. But looking at sort of very long-term, creeping potential social problems like the one you're mentioning, it's the trend that sort of sneaks up on you and you're never quite sure when it's going to be a crisis or reach a tipping point. It's very difficult for I think any national security decision maker to really grapple with, given everything else that's consuming their time and attention. Now, to your broader point about income inequality and its potentiality for political instability, several analysts I've spoken to endorse that wholeheartedly and think that this is coming and it is going to be a real concern for us. And they point to, in fact, what we've seen breaking out across the Arab states as an example of that. There's a good number of other analysts, though, who suggest that actually political instability rises from other simpler types of metrics. If there's been a civil war recently in a neighboring state, or if infant mortality peaks above a certain measure. I don't know that we really completely understand what makes states tick and what causes a people to finally decide that they're unhappy with the status quo or the form of governance that they're currently under. And so I also maybe am a little bit worried about trying to ascribe overly much causality to any one particular factor.
Okay, thanks very much. By the way, these are the kind of themes that we'll come up with today, and they're not interconnected. They are interconnected. So for example, if you look at the uprisings in the Arab world as a result of what has been called the Arab Spring, and you look in Tunisia, or you look in Egypt, or you look in Syria, precursors to these uprisings included not only growing income inequality, but also climate issues. Droughts were directly related to the upheaval in all of these countries, and rising food prices and food shortages and tensions that came out of that. So while the issues that we may be talking about here, whether it's climate or income inequality, do seem remote sometimes and the causality is hard to draw, they clearly play a role of some sort. And so one of the things we're trying to do here is to weave together some of these things that are drivers of insecurity and drivers of growth, and that's what we'll do throughout the day. Now, I want to give you just a little bit of sort of the working order from here. This panel is supposed to end at 10:45. It's 10:45, so it's going to end now.